Now to the next aspect of context, the manner of our participation in meaning, the different participatory functions through which meanings pass. Many theories of meaning focus on communication. They centre on the self as an effective message bearer and how people get their meanings across. We want to develop a broader view of meaning that we call participation, where the focus is more on the social traffic between minds and the world. For this, we want to make some distinctions that are often not clearly made between representation, communication, and interpretation. These are very different kinds of activity, not that one can ever be separated from the other. Here we want to come back to our idea of transposition. Not only are we always moving between these kinds of meaning activity, the meaning, as we've been saying repeatedly through this series of videos, is in the restive movement itself. Let me illustrate the distinction with the example of speech. Representation is speaking to oneself. You might be talking to yourself in the noisy silence of your mind, thinking something through. You might be rehearsing what you're about to say. You may never even say what you're thinking. This is representation without communication. Your resources for thinking are in the language you have learned to speak, or at least some of your meanings, because, as we're arguing, you have other resources for meaning in the form of imaging, experiencing objects, embodied action, and other forms of meaning that we have been examining in this multimodal grammar. Not that representation is just in your head, of course. Representation is also externalized. You might mutter or rehearse your lines for a presentation. You might write notes to self or a to-do-it list, or you might write a personal diary. You might draw a diagram to help you think something through. You might walk through a space to get a sense of the lie of the land. These kinds of representations are not just in your head. We use material artifacts to support our representations or meanings which are just for ourselves. We like to call these things cognitive prostheses, extensions of our mind, objects that we use to extend our thinking. And that's why we have circled the whole body as a site of representation. And even when the representations are just in our heads, in dreams even, we find ourselves rehearsing in our mind's eye ways of meaning that we have in the first instance experienced in the material world and the social forms of its meaning that we have learned. Spoken words, silently thought, mental images brought to mind, remembered or planned course of interaction with objects or moving through a space, envisioned bodily movements. These sources of our meaning are social and material. But if you happen to have made visible or tangible moves in your thinking, another person may chance upon the material traces of your meaning. Only then does communication happen. They may hear you muttering, they may come across your to-do list, they may see you walking through a space, they may overhear you practicing a musical instrument. You may never have meant them to come across your representation, but as soon as they do, this has become communication. However, much of our meaning is meant for others. It is directed outward. If representation is meaning for ourselves, then communication is meaning for others. Our example in this sketch is speaking, let's say, with the purpose of communication. It's not as if when you communicate, your meaning becomes the other person's meaning, that they hear what you're saying in the exact way you meant it. This is the grand fantasy of communication, when misunderstanding is considered to be failed communication. In a theory that takes interpretation into account, some degree of misunderstanding is the norm, or we should say this less negatively, a different understanding. Because the listener in this example re-represents what they hear based on the context of their own experience and interest. This is interpretation. The meaning they make has its source in the communication they have encountered, but is never the same as the meaning makers. In fact, re-representation is a redesign. Not that their interpretation is disconnected from the speakers, even though their meaning is not quite the same as the speakers, perhaps. If they've heard the communication at all, their world, in some senses, even in a small sense, has been changed. In Western societies, we have for a long time privileged communication over representation and interpretation. Here is St. Benedict of Nursia, issuing his monastic rule in about 530. The Western monastic system that Benedict founded was to become the basis of the college system of the first universities, and after that, one of the central logics of modern education with its bias towards communication. So this is what St. Benedict said in his rule. For it belongeth to the master to speak and to teach, and it becometh the disciple to be silent and listen. If therefore anything must be asked of the superior, the abbot in the case of the monastery, be it asked with all humility and with respectful submission. Benedict set in train a whole tradition of participation in spoken meaning. Artifacts like the lecture, the sermon, and maybe also instructional videos, maybe even the one that you're watching now is in the same tradition. And of course, MOOCs and flipped classrooms and a whole lot of modern things, but this is this particular tradition of discourse, where one party is silent while the other speaks, on the assumption that the silent party will get what has been communicated to them. This bias in favour of communication is at the expense of the other aspects of participation in meaning that we've been looking at, representation and interpretation. Acknowledge the learner, we would plead with teachers today, and give them the power to make meaning for themselves through interpretation. Now here's a nice quote from the philosopher John Dewey. Of all affairs, communication is the most wonderful, that things should be able to pass from the plane of external pushing and pulling to that of revealing themselves, and that the fruit of communication should be participation, sharing. This is a wonder by the side of which transubstantiation pales. Transubstantiation occurs in the Catholic Eucharist, as we were saying a moment ago, when the bread and wine becomes the body and blood of Christ. We take the idea of participation from Dewey, though communication is only one part of this picture. We frame it slightly differently as the insistent, edgy movement of our meanings, the transposition of representation into communication, into interpretation, and as a kind of re-representation. Across every move there is something to be shared in the meaning, and also something changes. Meanings are always anxiously begging to differ, and the task of a transpositional grammar is to trace the patterns of their differing.
Now I want to take two examples of these transpositions, moving between representation, communication, and interpretation. The first about speech and the second about image. The Russian psychologist Lev Vygotsky made a distinction between inner speech and externalized speech. Inner speech is representation. Externalized speech is communication. Learning to speak, young children often talk aloud to themselves. There is no distinction between their internalized and externalized speech. But as their speech develops, their inner speech becomes more and more different from their externalized speech. For instance, as a fully developed speaker, when you are trying to communicate, you need to orient the hearer by starting a clause with a subject or a given. But when we are talking to ourselves, all we need is a predicate or a new, because the subject is already in our mind's eye. Or, in our terms, as the child develops their capacity to speak and think, the grammar of representation in speech becomes more and more different from the grammar of communication in speech. And the distance travelled in the transposition between the two becomes larger. Now, an imaging example. I'm going to say to you the words, the Eiffel Tower. Most likely, what first springs to mind is a picture and not the shape of these words. And if your mind drifted onto thinking about the Eiffel Tower without having mentioned it, what would come to mind would be the image before sound shape of its spoken name. We take issue with the thinkers who privilege language and human meaning. We think in images at least as much as we think in words, and also in our embodied experiences of space. If we walk down the Champ de Mars towards the Eiffel Tower, the object, if we climb the stairs instead of taking the elevator and touched its steel ribs. Noam Chomsky says the heart of human thinking is language, and language is hardwired into the brain. Both assumptions are occupational hazards for linguists. Thinking is as much about other things, such as imaging and embodied feeling, and these are things you have learnt. Nobody is born able to recognize the Eiffel Tower. Where do our mental images come from? You have probably seen countless pictures of the Eiffel Tower, and you may have been there. Mental images are the equivalent in the realm of image to Vygotsky's inner speech. Both are representations. Now we're communicating the Eiffel Tower in a photograph. You almost certainly didn't have this particular one in mind just now, unless you've seen this video before or seen this picture on our website. This is a photograph taken late afternoon on a foggy winter's day, not the usual tourist angle, in the anniversary year of the tower's construction, 1989. Hence the 100 years lights running up the tower. We can discover new things in the experience of communicated meaning. The point we want to make is this. As representations, mental images are grammatically quite different from meanings communicated in perception, the seeing of images or the objects and spaces themselves. In your mental images, you conjure up some criterial features. These have allowed you to recognize this image. But when communication of meaning is by perception of image, object or space, there is an infinity of detailed and varied possibilities in the seeing. Then another transposition, interpretation. What the image means to me, how I connect to it, with other images of the Eiffel Tower that I've seen, or if I have been there, my own experience. If I have been there, the tower as object itself communicated its meaning to me, and there certainly would have been some revelations in that experience that have stayed with me. However, if you have been there, your experience can never have been quite the same as mine. Our conclusions, the difference between representation, communication, and interpretation as kinds of participation in meaning are large and important, and the transpositions essential in experience of meaning.